Hi, Kate.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Kate Manne. You teach philosophy at Cornell University. You've written a book that's gotten a lot of attention called Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny. And by the way, I just saw today that, this website, 5 Books, where they go to experts and ask them to name the 5 best books in their field, I think, of the year. And yours was named one of the 5 best books in philosophy by Nigel Warburton, who also does the Philosophy Bites podcast. And as if that weren't enough, you had already gotten the 5 Books Award in another category this year from Paul Bloom, right, the psychologist at Yale. But that was like books about cruelty or something? I mean, it was books about, that was a darker category. What was?
Books about evil and cruelty. Not mine personally, cross fingers. But yeah, I was so honored by both inclusions. I never expected this book to be read. So it's been just really humbling. I mean, genuinely, hugely humbling. And I'm really pleased because I wanted my message to be out there, to be fruitfully debated, and that has happened. So I'm just very, very grateful.
Well, the issues it deals with have become only more prominent since you started writing it. I mean, you started writing it, I presume, before Me Too became a hashtag?
Yes, in fact, it was in press. I think it became a Kindle book just a few days. I think it was before, or maybe it was after Alyssa Milano popularized the Me Too hashtag, the movement having been pioneered over a decade ago by Tarana Burke. But yeah, so all of this was unknown to me when I wrote it, and I think the timing has been, well, certainly as an author, very auspicious, but it's also been really good for the book, I think, to hit at a moment when people are trying to think through misogyny.
Yeah. So I'm glad to have somebody writing about misogyny, because for one thing, it's a term whose meaning I've always been a little unclear on. I mean, it's like a lot of terms like sexism, racism. One reason I'm reluctant to call people things like sexist and racist is that I'm honestly not sure of what the prevailing definition is. I mean, you can always imagine people who would be so egregiously members of the category that they would qualify, but it's just that you don't know like where the borderline is. And in the case of misogyny, I think you're taking quite a different approach from what's normally taken. I mean, again, not that an approach is very often systematically taken at all, right? These terms are used a lot more often than they are defined. But in the case of misogyny, I had always just thought, well, someone who hates women, and you're approaching it from kind of a different tack altogether, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think the word came to be more prominent around 2012. There's a big Google spike if you look at the Ngram for, usage in headlines. And the number of times it was Googled. And my feeling is that people are reluctant to use the term misogynist, and I myself actually share that reluctance. So I tend to focus less on misogynists as agents and more as misogyny as a social property of environments or social structures. And the thing about terms like misogynist is once you apply them second personally, it's very rare to get first personal uptake. So there's
in other words, if you accuse someone of being a misogynist, they very rarely say you're right.
Yeah. Whereas if you call someone an asshole, to use like my friend Aaron James's technical term, they'll sometimes say, yeah, I was being a bit of an asshole. I mean, maybe calling them an asshole versus you're being an asshole is, again, an important distinction here, but there's more chance of getting that going from the second person finger pointing mode to the first personal, you know what, you have a point.
Yeah.
So I do think the term misogynist has a use as a kind of warning label third personally. Like I use it as a threshold term for what I call overachievers in perpetuating misogyny, but I'm most interested in the social structures and systems. So that's how my approach maybe differs a little from, what I sometimes think of as the naive version of a first pass definition of the term and its cognates.
Okay, so misogyny is more about a whole system of control, of social control, than it is about the state of mind of a person. And in fact, even if you might call someone a misogynist, but if you did, that would be more about their behavior than about their state of mind. Is that right?
Right, exactly. So I'm interested both in making misogyny clearly a political and structural phenomenon and in de-psychologizing it. So for a slogan, I think of misogyny as something girls and women face, not as something that men, among others, feel. Okay.
So what are some of the behaviors that you would associate with misogyny? Well, what kinds of behaviors would in your mind deservedly get a man labeled a misogynist?
So I think, I start my book with 3 examples of men who've committed acts of, or who have very plausibly committed acts of domestic violence or sexual assault, or in 2 cases, strangulation. And one thing that's interesting about strangulation is both that it's, according to experts, an attempt to exert dominance or control, particularly when someone steps out of line. And the other thing that's interesting about it for my purposes is the perpetrators are almost invariably male. So well over 99% of perpetrators, according to meta-analyses, are male. So even though only perhaps a tiny fraction of men strangle, almost only men strangle. And that seems to me very significant. So that's one of the things that, when it is directed at girls and women, gives it some of the properties that I associate with misogynistic act of social control and domination, that is an attempt to get often a female intimate partner back in line when she has erred by patriarchal likes. And it's most often practiced by men.
So, and it can be lethal or non-lethal.
Yes, it's most often not. So I actually begin with non-fatal manual strangulation just because some of the technical terms are useful here, because we often use a non-synonym incorrectly, which is choking, that should refer just to obstruction of the airway with an external object that's been ingested, causing a blockage, primarily, food. That's what choking is. Strangulation emphasizes the fact that it's hands, or in some cases an object, a ligature around a neck.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I mean, what some people may be thinking is that's a pretty extreme form of social control. In other words, presumably when you talk about the larger system of social control that misogyny is part of, you're talking about a lot of non-physical coercion as well.
Yeah, no, I certainly am. I do think, though, there's a slight tendency to hesitate for bad as well as good reasons to use violence as an example. So the 3 people who are in the introduction of my book are Donald Trump, Andy Puzder, his original pick for Labour Secretary, and Steve Bannon. And the fact that these men, among others in the White House and most recently Brett Kavanaugh, rose to positions of power under or within the Trump administration with comparatively little attention actually given to their egregious acts of misogyny that are very well documented and plausible, struck me as really interesting. So it's as much about the social lack of reaction as well as the act itself, and the sort of pointed indifference or unwitting kind of hostile silence surrounding some of these acts is what I think of as one of the subtler, without being small, forms misogyny takes. It's really hard to get uptake. Like, think of Christine Blasey Ford, like all she did, and it wasn't in the end enough.
Right. So now that case involves, again, physical coercion. With Trump and Bannon, are you thinking about that or thinking about something?
Yeah. So Bannon was accused very credibly, again, police reports, photographic evidence of strangulation of his former wife, Mary Louise Picard. And this isn't very widely known, I think.
Right. It didn't get much publicity, I think.
No, and I say this as a Jew, I really feel like his anti-Semitism got a lot more attention, and rightly so. It didn't deserve less. But I do think his misogyny was sort of assumed to be a side issue somehow, or somehow this silence develops. So there was that. There was Puzder's abuse of his ex-wife, and Trump's very plausible sexual assault of his then wife, Ivana. But you're of course right that these forms of violence just serve to illuminate partly some of the subtler forms of control that are at issue. So something as simple as being a little taken aback when a woman asserts herself against the will of a dominant man, even just by disagreeing with him in conversation, just being a little just subtly taken aback in ways that can be very epistemically ambiguous. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying they're always clear cut, which makes it, again, subtle in two ways. It's both a smaller kind of ripple under the surface of patriarchal relations, but it's also epistemically how we come to know about these things is murkier. And often you don't know in any individual instance. It's just that cumulatively you can observe patterns. Mm-hmm. So does that make sense as one way in which we can kind of ratchet down the drama of those examples and see how continuous this is with practices that I think most, if not all of us, are either complicit in or turn a so-called blind eye to. Actually, I withdraw that. That's an ableist metaphor, but find it a bit hard to replace. So that's my bad. But yeah, we overlook. Oh, it's ableist too.
Overlook I would say I'm not an expert on ableism because I'm like of a generation that just really didn't focus on these issues. But I would say my understanding of overlooking is that it's something all people do from time to time. It's
maybe we could say oblivious.
What's that?
People are oblivious to, which is more neutral. By the way, I belabor the point partly because I started by saying misogynist is a shaming label. And I think one thing I've tried to do in my own practice as a moral philosopher is when I screw up, as I inevitably do, or even borderline screw up, I try as best I can, sometimes shamefacedly, to kind of own it and just move on and think out loud to my students or colleagues or interlocutors like, maybe that is a problem. Could I do better? It's
an all too rare human behavior. Well,
it took me a long time to get there, but I wanted my students to be less anxious about backtracking, changing minds, disagreeing with themselves, and also saying, "Oh, I see your point," without defensiveness. So I tried as best I could, often again screwing up in the process of trying to model screwing up without social calamity to do that a little bit in a less anxious way.
I like the idea of like modeling screwing up being a good thing. Like that takes some of the pressure off. It
really does. I mean, I'm a very anxious person, and I think, I'm like Paul Bloom, I'm skeptical of the role of empathy as it's sometimes billed as a moral panacea. It's not. I think he's completely right about that. But I do think it has a nice role in helping us think through different sides of the coin of certain moral predicaments. So what would it do to someone to be in a situation where it's very rare or very taboo to say, I said something that perpetuated a form of discrimination or bigotry that I wholeheartedly, rationally disavow, but I'm aware I'm bound up in these systems, so you know, I'm bound to make mistakes, and it's on me to not be backwards looking, trying to minimize fault and keep my hands clean, but forward looking, like what can I do to be conscientious and make myself and maybe other people sometimes a little better bit by bit. Yeah, no, I mean, we all imbibe a lot more in the way of norms and tendencies than we're aware of, and it's hard to escape. I mean, you know, I grew up in a world, I mean, it was both a time when it was both a very different time in terms of the way gender relations are thought of. And also, my family was probably more culturally conservative than most. So it was a very traditional division of labor between man and woman. And I want to kind of step back and talk about that a little, maybe in a slightly more abstract rubric, which is sexism and patriarchy. I think maybe it would be good to step back and talk about what you mean by sexism and patriarchy, because misogyny, in your view, is in the service of those things, right? Yes, definitely. So I think this is another way in which misogyny is kind of subtle. So it actually circles back nicely to that question that we opened with. I think often misogyny is more a disposition. I analogize it, not in the book, but in more recent, well, not writings, just thoughts, to a shock collar that keeps the dog behind an invisible fence. And so the dog learns very quickly not to go behind or around or over certain bounds, which are operative even when the dog isn't experiencing any pain or shocks or violence of any kind, or even the slight, like, jarring of the mildest version of this. And in this metaphor, the woman is the one with the shock collar on. Yeah. She is the one who things might seem seamless, but that might be largely because she's conforming to patriarchal roles and expectations, where I think of it, you know, the children's book, The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein. I don't know it. I know the name, but yeah, it's this book where this tree, it's meant to be this beautiful children's story, and it's still very popular. It was written in 1963, I believe, and might be 64, but it involves a tree who is referred to using the female pronoun, giving everything she has to the boy, who is pretty obviously a son-like figure to her. So she gives her leaves, her branches, her apples. He goes off to the city to have adventures. He goes out to build a boat using her limbs, basically, her labor, and he comes back and he rests on her, and by this point she's an amputated stump. And it's meant to be a beautiful story, even though there's this haunting, like, penultimate stanza where it says, and the tree was happy, but not really. It says not really? But not really. It says that in the book? Says that in the book. It never gets expanded on. That makes it a somewhat more profound book than it might have been otherwise, doesn't it? Well, yeah. I think of it as an unwittingly brilliant parable for patriarchal social relations. And I think of misogyny as the violence that can kick in when they're disrupted, when she doesn't give a suitable him, a suitable boy, everything and anything she can.
Okay, so
And
this is a
sexism,
case where the female is expected to be just endlessly giving to the point of self-harm.
yeah.
And is that idea, is that a part of what patriarchy is? What is your definition of patriarchy?
So technically, I mean, I leave it somewhat open-ended, but I think, let's say, just as a shorthand, I think that is the paradigm of patriarchal social relations, particularly in the Western context that I'm most interested in. So I'm often analyzing, I think of myself as an analyst of culture and doing analytic philosophy of culture, among other things in this book. And so I'm often talking about the US and Australia, where I hail from, and other contexts that kind of allege to be post-patriarchal, but I think actually the form patriarchy takes is this expectation that she be in relation, always somebody, someone, never her own person, and also accept in precarious ways, ideally in the most conservative version of this, related primarily to men and not others in the community, not to women, not to non-binary persons, and certainly not just a single agent autonomously trying to achieve certain personal projects, in Bernard Williams' phrase. So I think of sexism then as the ideology that kind of shores this morally bankrupt but very powerful system of patriarchal roles up. It's kind of the bad science of patriarchy, or it's too bad science as misogyny is to corrupt law enforcement.
Okay. So in a patriarchal society, there is, first of all, an imbalance of power between kind of the average man and the average woman. I assume that's definite. Is that not definitional?
So I think power has been over-focused on here. I think women can have plenty of power in these situations in some senses, but it's not autonomous power, it's power in service. And I think sexism can be more skeptical of women's powers sometimes, but misogyny in particular is often fine with women who perform these powerful roles. I mean, think of Trump has a lot of women in pretty prominent positions, but as soon as they threaten or challenge his will, you know, they're toast. So I think there's a sense in which power is prohibited to women who are against a patriarchal ethos, but there is, you know, a pretty large phenomenon of, as Andrea Dworkin called them, right-wing women who the trade-off, and I think this is true for a lot of white women, is power comes at the cost of being morally autonomous and having integrity. You kowtow to powerful, especially in this context, white patriarchs, in order to have your modicum of power in service of his interests, or at least not opposed to them. Okay,
so these right-wing women you're talking about who had achieved power in one sense are still buying into the idea that the role of the woman is to serve in a specific kind of sense.
Yeah, maybe not wittingly. In fact, I think probably most often unwittingly. But I think the fact that, a lot of this power comes to women who are explicitly saying sexist things like women just naturally staying at home and raising families over certain masculine coded jobs. They prefer feminine coded labor and they're better at it. You have figures like Phyllis Schlafly, famously, actually her husband was the one at home raising the kids. And so one point you can make there is about a kind of hypocrisy that I don't think is so interesting in this context. But another point is just that, like, in some ways she was a very, like, fierce and impressive woman, albeit with no moral scruples, or at least no moral compass, who then perpetuated some of the very social roles that she was benefiting from breaking down. because she had a very supportive husband who took care of the kids while she went on tours, like with her books and thoughts and, her leadership roles. But that's kind of fine and often accepted if she's saying something consistent with a conservative patriarchal message or indeed in direct service of it. Mm. And so does that make sense of why I'm wary of the idea women are forbidden power?
Yeah, I've always thought power is a more subtle and diffuse concept, is a more subtle concept than people give it credit for. Like within any given relationship, usually both people have a kind of leverage, and it's so just to focus on power per se can be more complicated than.
Yeah, it's kind of not one of my words for that reason. I think that's a really good point. I know of no fully satisfying philosophical definition, but I think it's a very polysemous, it has there are many senses of the term power that tend to be close enough to each other that they're easily confused.
Yeah. There are more clear-cut cases. If you're using physical coercion to narrow a person's alternatives to being with you,
right,
that's a very distinctive kind of exercise of power. One question I had is that came to me while you were just talking is the belief that there are some inherent differences between men and women in at least a statistical sense.
Yeah.
Like, let's say somebody says, well, I think women are more nurturing toward infants on balance. It's in their genes. If someone says that but does not use it to justify the status quo, is that still sexist inherently?
So I think it would depend. Sometimes those observations are true and important and interesting and I'll make them because they have to do with internalized social norms. I think it has a lot to do with whether or not one is referring or trying to refer to men's and women's inherent natures somehow. And the point that I make there is that, look, it's not that there couldn't be statistical differences, even maybe interesting ones, although I'm a little skeptical partly because on grounds that I can get into later, a lot of this is like predicated on gender binarism that isn't, scientifically or morally accurate. But look, there could be some statistical generalizations, but we can't know them yet. When it comes to inherent natures, there's no control group in a patriarchal culture that, pretty much all cultures since agriculture have had strong patriarchal elements. Mm-hmm. And so we have no control group of people raised in a non-patriarchal culture.
Because there are no non-patriarchal cultures in the world, in your view, I take it.
So I think there are many where a lot of progress has been made, but there are also elements of backlash. So I think there are some very progressive cultures that you often see simultaneous to that progress, and in fact, I suspect partly because of it, simultaneous backlash, resentment, a sense of aggrieved entitlement on men's part. So this is not to say that the US and Australia, for my main examples, are without enormous forms of feminist social progress and egalitarian progress more generally. But I also think those forms of progress have come. I wouldn't be here if, if that progress hadn't been made. But at the same time, I think they come with a lot of social penalties and attempts to reinforce or restore the status quo of a patriarchal kind.
Okay. And if on this question of inherent differences between men and women, so one thing you're saying is science can't know for sure. We can't know for sure, or at least right now.
There are often uninteresting claims that are put out there as hypotheses in marked disproportion to their potential interest or knowability at this point in human history. So I think in practice, even though it's because we can't know a lot of these things and it's not possible to find out, and it's often unclear what the knowledge would be really used for, I think a lot of generalizations about men and women, boys and girls that get at inherent natures are sexist and are just bad science, frankly.
And so they are, for now, they are sexist. If someday science proved there were differences, would the belief cease to be sexist?
Yeah, so these have to be in service of rationalizing and naturalizing a patriarchal social order that I take to be an immoral thing. And I don't think that certain truths that could eventually be discovered, it's true that they could be weaponized in ways that would constitute a sexist utterance, but they wouldn't be inherently sexist qua proposition. So there are some subtleties in there, but my main point, at any rate, is that the energy and sort of friction around some of these claims and the way that it's wielded often constitutes sexism here and now, given what we know.
And is that independent of the person's motivation? I mean,
yes. Yeah, completely.
Because these ideas are used in the service of maybe patriarchy or oppression or whatever you want to say, because they're used in that service, they are sexist regardless of whether the person
is sexist. I think that's right. Just as a statement can be racist without meaning. So again, I'd be happy to call it a sexist act, or in the analogous case, a racist act to that utterance. But because I treat terms like misogynist and to the extent that I even use it, sexist, it's actually unusual, I think, in ordinary terms to call someone a sexist. And we can all be sexist to varying degrees. It's much more usual to call someone a misogynist.
That's a good point. It is. You say, if somebody says something, you say that is sexist.
Right. But and I actually find that quite useful. So I, in fact, in the book, don't officially define sexist as applied to agents, because I note that usage is uncommon and I don't want to feed into that. But if you were to define sexist analogously to the way I define misogynist, it would just be someone who does this a bunch, regardless of their intent. And of course, if they have the intent, or at least unwitting kind of sexist motivation, it's more likely they'll fall into this category. But they could just be very influenced by misogynistic culture or sexist science. In general, I don't like to speculate about others' motivations. It's kind of fruitless, and I don't regard myself as having enormous insight into my own motivations. So I think one can debunk and offer alternative explanations that are even-handed, could apply to oneself as much as others, but don't kind of offer a take on someone's deep psychology or, sort of malicious motivations, which isn't to say they're not, it's not to say they're never there.
Yeah, I think the world would be a much more pleasant place if more people refrained from speculating about others' motivations, although it's very hard not to do, because there's a very strong inclination, especially when someone does something you don't like or does something to you personally, it's just so automatic to attribute motivation to them and believe it.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I think that's, probably, I think it's safe to say I'm a little more partial to evolutionary psychology than you are. And I do think one thing that natural selection probably designed the human brain to do is defend its own or defend the person's interest in moral language. I mean, the idea is that winning moral arguments was good for our genes at some point in the past, whether or not it is now. And that, in theory, could account for a lot of aspects of our kind of moralistic psychology. But it's a very strong tendency.
I don't find that implausible. As we talked a little bit about before we hit the record button, I've been, reading / I've actually been listening to the audiobook of your book, because I'm a huge audiobook person, because they, funnily enough, I don't get anxious with audiobooks because they go at their own pace and I can pause, but I don't worry I've missed something and, you know, go over the same paragraph 17 times. I have to make it, the default is to just keep going.
So it's a kind of an OCD override mechanism?
Yeah. I'm the kind of person who's never been diagnosed with OCD, but I could get a diagnosis in like a second if I said the right things. So psychologist, you know, it's just my OCD happens to be, or, you know, as much as that's the right way of thinking about it, it's done me very well professionally, which is probably a poor reflection on modern late capitalist and academic mores, and poor reflection on myself and laziness, where I'm not so obsessive. But anyway, I've been listening to the audiobook and I actually find those explanations very plausible. I just don't know how to give them myself. You know, in my book, I talk a little bit about the disgust that I think women sometimes attract when they occupy counter-social, stereotypical, feminine-coded roles. So women who are competing with men for male-dominated leadership positions, I think sometimes elicit disgust. And one of the things I found it really helpful to think about was some of the work on evolutionary psychology, the psychology of disgust and its role in making us avoid something with a kind of one-trial learning for obvious reasons. You know, if something is foul or contaminated or nauseating, the benefits of just very quick learning that to avoid that thing, as well as a sort of glittering attraction to it, to keep an eye on it. To me, that sort of explanation of the way disgust both seeps and sticks and stains, but also spreads in the social environment. Yeah, I didn't exactly put it from, you know, an Evo-Devo point of view, but that perspective actually really helped me, you know, think about why disgust would have these weird features of being extremely hard to erase and sticky and catching socially. So a lot of people pick up misogyny toward female political figures or public figures, not because they would be misogynistic towards them if they were just like in a vacuum, but because other people evince disgust. And I think we pick that up.
Yeah.
Anyway,
by the way, we should probably say that the book you've been listening to of mine is my book on Buddhism.
Oh, sorry.
It's not an earlier book
why Buddhism is
psychology.
true.
I say that to protect you against the allegation that you endorsed an earlier book of mine, which you might be less inclined to endorse. But
I haven't read that. I confess. Is that The Moral Animal?
The Moral Animal, yeah. But I mean, I encourage you to read it. I don't discourage anyone from reading anything I've written. But the evolutionary psychology is it's part of the backdrop of the Buddhism book, but it's not a full-fledged exploration. But I think you're right. I mean, disgust and a whole lot of things. I mean, I really think this is the. I hope that the next phase in human cultural evolution will be just a much greater awareness of the various senses in which our cognition and perception are kind of biased by the very nature of the brain.
Amen. Nothing would be more useful in certain ways. And one thing that resonated for me with in reading Why Buddhism is True is that, and I should say I have no background in studying or thinking about Buddhism, so this is all new to me. But one point that really resonated was, if we could just accept how biased we are, to put it, maybe you don't quite put it in these normative terms, but if we were less averse to the very strong evidence of how poor we are at distinguishing reasoning from post hoc rationalization, we might be much kinder to ourselves and others in ways that would be hugely helpful to, you know, to us, ours, and others. I mean, I can scarcely think of any better way of capturing what I tried to do every day from sort of August 2015 until November 9th, 2016, when Trump was elected, then try to explain to people, you're not as reliable as you think you are when it comes to judging Clinton.
Now, what do you mean by that?
What I mean, so this is just one example. I wrote an article for HuffPo in 2016 in March, which listed a bunch of descriptions. She's disingenuous. She has so many masks. Who has seen her face? She has no true political views. May as well vote for the right-wing guy because at least he stands for something. Practically Machiavellian, on and on. And that she was carefully coiffed, posed, but had no ideas or principles. Utterly corrupt. And everyone assumed it was a description of Hillary Clinton. It wasn't. It was a description of Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of my country, just after she took power via an internal leadership challenge in Australia. And then, it was all downhill since an election that she very narrowly won just by virtue of forming a coalition government in ways that are completely standard in Australia, to make various compromises and deals, but cost her so much that she was called Juliar as a household moniker. So, the stuff about the lying, the trustworthiness, the record breaking lows on trustworthiness despite having better than average records for politicians, none of this is defending. I haven't said a word in defense of Gillard or Hillary. I'm much further to the left myself, but as far as I was concerned, people had a straightforward decision. If they, unlike me as an immigrant, I can't vote in this country, but if you could, as as someone in the US who, is a citizen and is not disenfranchised, you had a simple choice to make between voting for someone who I thought reasonable minds could disagree vastly about her merits. I'm not even sure how to assess, claims about political character, moral integrity, purity, and I'm a moral philosopher. This is what I do, versus someone who would risk destroying the planet. That's a no-brainer. Reasonable minds can disagree about whether Clinton would have been infinitely better or much, much better. But beyond that.
Yeah, it's funny. The description you gave that people took as referring to Hillary Clinton is not exactly what I would have thought was the stereotype about her that did her damage. I mean, I thought a lot of people thought she did have convictions about policies. I mean, a lot of people on the right, that she had convictions about policies. It's just that she would do anything to impose them on America. And above all, I think a damaging perception was that she looked down on these ordinary.
Oh, yeah. After the deplorables
and so on.
Yeah, that's true. That certainly did a lot of damage.
I guess, so I'm inferring that you think that the outcome of this election is partly a result of maybe all of the above: patriarchy, sexism, and misogyny. Is that,
it was my prediction, at least rightly or wrongly, since August 2015 that Trump would win over Clinton, partly due to gender dynamics that predicted low voter turnout for Clinton.
Yeah.
And now that could have just been an unwarranted hunch that turned out to be a lucky guess, but that does look to be part of the causal explanation. Of course, not the full explanation. So part of my point has often been, let's not purely think in terms of wonkish statistics. So one good question is why Trump won in terms of the sort of analysis you might expect from 538. And another good question is what sorts of factors determined or over-determined the outcome, which was very narrow and which I think we can agree in a close possible world would have been different. And I think misogyny was certainly a big factor that deserved to be taken into account, just to circle back in the way people thought about their own decision. I wish people had been more skeptical that their sense of visceral distaste for Hillary, if they'd thought, well, maybe that comes from me and my moral judgment, or maybe it comes from moral judgments that aren't very reliable, or maybe it comes from like being on social media where people are putting up all these videos that, there was a lot of powerful, disgust iconography of her, say, spitting a tiny sliver of cough drop into a glass of water because she was about to speak and didn't want to swallow it. Like,
so that became like a meme.
It became a huge, like, internet right-wing conspiracy theory, Hillary, like, vomits into glass, like, alien, like, I mean, it was, just the usual nutso crap, but it captured some sort of, just as the Obama birther, the endless, spurious questions, where are you from really, is sort of at the heart of racism. The what are you doing here, with a disgusted tone of voice when women challenge male dominance. Like, I think that's very at the heart of misogyny, at least in one particular form, where, spaghetti is thrown at the wall of potential reasons why one just can't vote for her, one would be complicit, one would be this, one would be that. And, I wish more people had just thought about the possibility that those kind of visceral hunches and suspicions and mistrust was either misguided or would have been just as appropriate in analogous cases where they wouldn't hesitate to vote for a male counterpart, however imperfect.
So I gather the misogyny, just to be clear on exactly how the term is being used here, because she was viewed as a threat to the patriarchy, kind of, coercive measures kicked in, or I guess kind of policing mechanisms designed to keep her from becoming a more formidable threat to the patriarchy, that is, becoming president, kicked in. Now, are they misogynistic simply by virtue of their having been deployed to that end, or do they also have to, like, play on sexist stereotypes? In other words, if a man spitting a cough drop into a cup, had it been deployed in similarly dishonest fashion, if it were the case that would have had just as damaging effect, okay, is it still misogyny?
No. So that is a great question. So epistemically, what I require is that it either be disproportionate or distinctively gendered.
Okay.
So it doesn't have to play on sexist stereotypes or, say, disgust-based, like, especially high standards that women's, like, bodies, be pure and kind of, like, non-leaky, like a sealed envelope somehow. That was one of the metaphors in the disgust literature I liked, that disgust kind of highlights cracks in the body, But I think it has to be a reaction, and this can be very hard to know, that is either outsized, so disproportionate, versus a male counterpart, all else being equal, so holding fixed other intersecting social factors like race, class, disability, being cis or trans, sexuality, stuff like that. Or it can be, yes, a distinctively gendered response. Okay.
So first of all, misogyny is a shock collar used to keep women from threatening the patriarchy, but also you're saying by definition it has to be a shock collar that in a certain sense only works on women? In other words,
yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
it's in the nature of the shocks delivered that they wouldn't have the same effect on a man.
I think that's right. With the strong caveat that this is not to say that women have it worse. Say white women might have it, they might, and in fact do have many forms of privilege, say from mass incarceration, that nonetheless there are ways in which, if you look at the counterpart groups, if you compare black men and black women, Black women's predicament in terms of being incarcerated at rates that were in at least 2012 as disproportionately over the rates of white women as Black men compared to white men. The kind of relative erasure of Black women's predicament in that counts as misogyny of a distinctively anti-Black, misogynoirish kind, to use Moya Bailey's term. So you have to look at the counterpart relation, say Black men versus Black women, or white men versus white women, in ways that are sensitive to the judgment being made about relative privilege or subject to the controlling mechanism. So this isn't to say that white women are subject to, disproportionate incarceration. It's rather to say that, interestingly, the women who are subject to disproportionate incarceration, Black women, their predicament was relatively overlooked by people in my social circles, that is predominantly white liberals in the academy. And so that's one of the ways misogyny can manifest too, bearing in mind we have to be very careful here to do those intersectional analyses correctly so as to have non-misleading comparisons.
Okay. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't bring in Jordan Peterson, because you had a run-in with Jordan Peterson, right? I mean, for a while, was he threatening to sue you?
Yeah, he sent me a cease and desist letter, which...
I hope it's framed and on your wall.
I'm married to a lawyer so when I initially received this letter, I was in Italy in Turin giving a workshop on my book, and I got this letter because I hadn't responded to his initial emails, which I found just like full of shit.
So he was emailing you personally. There was a direct email exchange.
So I didn't respond just because the thought that I had defamed him by expressing my opinion about his work struck me as just straightforwardly incorrect. It was my opinion. And secondly, very hypocritical because he's well known for being a free speech or supposed free speech advocate when it comes to supposed enforced use of students' preferred pronouns at his home University of Toronto, which some might think is a common courtesy to use someone's preferred name or nickname or pronoun, but he objected to this as a huge violation of freedom of speech, made his name on the alt-right, and then, the reason why I, found it worthwhile to eventually, after biding my time, give the story to Rin Carmen at New York Magazine is he's done this to more than just me, at least one other case of a comparatively young in academic terms, female feminist professor, and these threats are just meant to silence, and I object. So anyway, I sent this cease and desist letter to my husband, and we had a good laugh about it, because fortunately, being married to a lawyer, he could tell me very quickly what other people are not in such a privileged position to know quickly, which is it was not a winner of a lawsuit, to put it mildly. It was serious.
What did you allegedly? Was this something you said in the Vox interview that he objected to, or
yeah, what? It was mostly in the Vox interview where, mostly it was just pointing to passages I wish people would examine more closely. Parts of the text, and I won't try to summarize because I'll inevitably bore the viewer/listener with, in my opinions, inserted liberally to remind you which speech act I'm engaging in the relevant legal sense. But there are parts of his book that I think bear a close look by people who, in fact, haven't read it fully or in full. And I really, after being asked to review it for the TLS, it took, I think, 4 editors to convince me to do this assignment because and I love the TLS, I love writing for them, but, it felt like a waste of my time. It's not intellectually, I think, very well-grounded material. But I also eventually read it and thought, yes, I think I can say something fruitful about this that isn't just another, that involves close reading of things that he elided or omitted that are very important. So he builds, say, the Columbine killer, one of the Columbine killer's diaries as an expression of existential angst, with the sense that anyone might suffer from it, without noting that the Columbine killer, this was a few quotes that were embedded in just vast rants of the most egregious racism and misogyny, and just hierarchical jostling generally. And if Peterson had noted this, it would have greatly undermined his case that, look, find a hierarchy and win in it. I think that's a terrible message, and it's the message of his first rule of life, in a way, is to, stand up straight with shoulders back, don't be a loser lobster. I think part of life is facing that there are lots of worthwhile things that are competitive and where we lose all the time. And that's fine.
So what connection had he made between so by his account, the Columbine killers had failed to thrive within a particular hierarchy, and his point was that he
actually doesn't say anything about hierarchy. He says the Columbine killers were having an existential crisis about the misery and suffering in the world.
That seems like a charitable.
No kidding. I mean, it's both very charitable and it's a complete non sequitur. Like, that's a better description of me at my lowest moments. And, it's one of the distinctions I draw in my book is between entitled shame and shame of a kind that doesn't want to tear out or destroy the eyes of the world, in Erik Erikson's phrase. It wants to hide. Most of us, even women as privileged as I am, and I am privileged in every respect by gender, we just want to hide when we're ashamed. We don't want to destroy others' eyes upon us. Mm-hmm. So I felt like this very specific predicament, that a predicament that needed to be diagnosed in chapter 1 had been completely overlooked in a way that was, in my opinion, borderline misleading in chapter, I think, 6 or whatever it was, where someone who is incredibly oriented to social hierarchy and winning and getting the women and these, horrid rape fantasies and these, uses of the N-word everywhere. A person like this is not someone who's having an existential crisis because people are, being mean to each other. He's one of the mean guys. I mean, duh.
Yeah, I have a question. So you've actually done the work of reading the book, and you're a philosopher, so you're going to ask the question of, I'm not clear on his logic. I mean, there's something known as the naturalistic fallacy, where it's generally recognized as an error to say that just because something is, like it's part of nature, like, okay, there are hierarchies in nature, in animal societies, there are hierarchies in human society. The naturalistic fallacy would be to say, because of that, then they are good. Whatever is natural is good. Now, I'm a little unclear on whether Peterson is committing that fallacy or just saying, hey, look, face it, there are these hierarchies. It's in your interest to, as a pragmatic matter, to reconcile yourself to that and do the things, given the context we're born into, do the things that make you thrive and make you happy and so on. Is he actually committing the naturalistic fallacy?
So this came up a bunch with Sean Elling, the interviewer for the Vox piece. I actually think the latter is the more charitable and plausible interpretation of Peterson. So I'm not saying that going through... The
latter being that he's not committing the naturalistic...
I don't think he is committing the naturalistic fallacy in any strict sense. I think you could comb through the text and make a case, but only by ignoring the sort of more plausible... I mean, he ought to make precisely that distinction and make it clear what he's up to. But I think you can make most of his points kind of stick if you think of it as like, on the trajectory of his argument. Most of the points will stick given the overarching narrative that you just sketched, which is more, look, whether or not this is ultimately a good thing in some cosmic sense, this is the way things are currently. Find a game, given that you're going to be playing a game and you need to be a winner, find a game to win. And that's not the naturalistic fallacy. The problem is actually more on the idea you need to win. That's not a need. Most of us are losers most of the time. And again, facing that and dealing with it gracefully. And also, like, I mean, if you are determined to win, you can never win. If you pick games that are rigged from the beginning, then you'll be fake winning. Just like Trump, like how to get sick of winning is how I think about, like...
I'm not sick of it yet, by the way. But
well,
as he predicted I would be by now, but...
I mean, I haven't experienced much of it in some sense.
Exactly.
I also think, like, that's the aim, is to be partly able to face the prospect of competitive challenges, as well as, of course, cooperative ones, which are very much, you know, he'll give lip service to it not all being games that are zero-sum, but there's the focus is relentlessly on more or less the paradigm of zero-sum games, again, in my opinion. And my point was, look, getting used to the fact that sometimes you may not be the best is part of what's at issue in fighting misogyny, because... And I think this point has been made to, you know, in parallel about racism and its intersection with misogyny, like getting used to not being superior because you were, like, given a false sense of superiority via a million internalized biases, social cues, and forms of ideology as someone who's white, actually accepting that that is all bullshit. That is something that, you know, the art of losing is hard to master, but master it we must, ironically.
Well, and somebody must master. I mean, that's the thing, because as you said, competition for status is a zero-sum game. So if the advice you're giving to people who read your book is how to become one of the winners, you're not actually improving the world as a whole. I mean, he would probably have an argument about how he is, but the point, if you look at it narrowly, for every winner, there's got to be a loser. Status is a zero-sum game. Right. And so it's like, what kind of prescription is that for the species as a whole? You know,
I think that's exactly right. And he literally gets around this problem by saying, you know, he talks about a game show where someone, like, was a winner at like, you know, some variant of, like, cup and ball, like some, like, or knocking spoons together, like, be the best at the game you can find. That's not being the best. Like, hello, that's like inventing fantasies and self-aggrandizing visions of yourself. Like, by all means do your own thing, but not because you're trying to avoid being not the best at a form of human excellence that you should otherwise be striving for, including moral excellence, where we all fall on our faces, we all make mistakes, and accepting that, accepting, like, a loss of moral status for a moment, but picking yourself back up and thinking, okay, what can I do moving forward to keep going in this case, not zero-sum, but still a game that, like, does have hierarchical elements. I think that's, like, that is the message that I would want to give to young people attracted to Peterson's message, like the art of losing. And I don't see that anywhere in him or in his ilk. I see this relentless, obsessive, and clearly false sense that you can always, like, somehow you have to be top lobster, and that's just not true. It's just not true.
No, I mean, there's a lot of self-help books whose premise is that it's true, but not alone.
That's right. However, there's also a lot of self-help books whose premise is one of the valid points he makes, which is that it's good to clean your room. So people will defend him by saying, look, he does give some good advice, like it's good to clean your room. I agree. So does Marie Kondo. So does Gretchen Rubin. So do so many feminine-coded, you know, it's like the premise of self-help in a way. It's like, get your life in order in ways that make, you know, your blah, blah, blah daily life less, you know, sort of hard to bear, and you'll be able to be more effective in the world, something like that. anyway, I just think it's not enough to get a few points right. You have to look at some of the messages there that are, frankly, they're to me, they seem clearly wrong, and they seem destructive for the kind of people who do need help in accepting in a way that, like embracing moments of shame, picking yourself up, hiding for a little while when you need to, practicing self-care when you need to, but not like endlessly stressing that you're not top lobster, because of course not, and it's not really like that. And who wants to pinch another lobster's eye stalk, really? Like, I mean, the metaphors are just alarming. So it might not be the naturalistic fallacy, but it's like, why the lobster metaphor?
Yeah, so we'll link to your review of his book into the Vox interview as well. I have a final question.
Sure.
That just occurred to me, actually, is, we are famously now in a period of ideological and even social polarization.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you're finding that complicates your getting your message across, because I'm like thinking of the Kavanaugh case, and a lot of the people who would be on the other side of the Kavanaugh issue from you, it's not necessarily that they're saying, "Oh, I think it's okay to hold a high school girl down on a bed and try to take her clothes off." It's that their ideological, political, social commitments led them to disbelieve the story in the first place. And let's leave aside the question of whether she was telling the truth. I found her credible, but the question is independent of that. The point is that to the extent that one's position on questions like that are determined by like prior social and political commitments, that's just kind of a conversation stopper, right?
It really is. And I think even to add to that, some people who were politically on the opposing side did believe her and just sort of didn't care at a certain level. Like just, I actually have a brilliant student, Amy Ramirez, currently working on Susan Collins's speech, the way Collins said, "I believe her." And then it just, the practical, the action upshot, which is, "Therefore I can't confirm him," never arrives. In fact, it goes in the other direction. I mean, polarization scares me hugely, but this is just a very general methodological point I think maybe is worth making. I never sugarcoat my message because of it. I just accept polarization. And what I try to do instead is what I think of as empathizing with our irrationality. And immorality. Like, I believe many irrational and immoral things that were convenient for me to believe because I was in a bad place. I can give examples, but in a way it's beside the point. I think we're all like this. We have our moments. And so instead of sort of listening to the Trump voter and indulging the whiny think pieces about the white, inevitably pictured as white, working class Trump voter, even though many Trump voters are affluent, working class people are not just white. Instead of doing that, I'm much more about saying, okay, I'm going to, tell my message to as many people as I can tell it to, and I don't write people off. But it's much more, the thought is polarization is real, but I write less to convince people than to crystallize the message for people who are either open-minded or, not so much on side as ready to have the kind of fruitful disagreements from this like rough side of the fence of taking patriarchy and misogyny seriously. So disagreements healthier all the time in a way my framework is meant to facilitate those disagreements. But for people who are just in deep denial, like, I think what I would want to see is more space to analogize, not to us at our rational best thinking something close to true, but saying we've all been in situations where we're mired in false beliefs and immoral principles that we're utterly like hanging on to for grim death. Or I at least want to say we should all be able to imagine going in that direction because of, there but for the grace of worker people go I ideology, our own, say, whiteness, in my case, you know, those things are hard. They can be hard for people to shake. So I say, don't write people off, but don't write, you know, I don't write for them or to them. I just hope that like some debunking story can somehow get through.
Yeah.
Does that make sense of how
I think so. I mean, one of my hobby horses, and I guess this is related, is to point out to my fellow anti-Trumpers cases where our side, in processing the day's news, is itself not really thinking clearly and maybe overreacting to certain things.
Good.
Or, jumping to conclusions unfavorable to Trump on the basis of fairly small amounts of evidence, and also, just as a tactical matter, sometimes doing that in ways that play into his hands. And so, and in fact, this is a chance to plug this newsletter that I and some other people put out called the Mindful Resistance newsletter.
Oh, interesting.
At mindfulresistance.net. But
I'll subscribe to. I will subscribe to your newsletter.
Well, God bless you. You've done more plugging of my stuff in a way than I've done. I feel guilty. So I will compensate for that by mentioning the title of your book 3 times now. Down girl. The Logic of Misogyny.
Can I give one example?
Congratulations. So it's published by Oxford University Press. It's gotten a lot of attention, and I'm in both academic circles and non-academic circles.
Thank you. Can I give one example of irrationality just because of my own? Just because I realized I was being a bit abstract, just to, if we have time. I spent a summer where my husband was very sick with Crohn's disease, theorizing that he had some kind of weird allergy, and like walking around Whole Foods trying to identify threats like corn or, I don't know, like some kind of special like sulfate allergy. I can't even remember the details, but what I remember is that my, reasonably quick, but nonetheless can be prone to like overthinking things brain got very caught up in this idea that there must be a solution. And it turned out there kind of was. Like he had an infection that he got during a surgery, C. diff, which can be fatal. So there was an explanation for why he wasn't recovering, and he was treated and he's now very well. But point being, I understand what it's like to get locked into an irrational, threat-seeking, as you might call it, module.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like the last thing I needed was someone to say, now let's listen to your ideas about this, because they were ridiculous and post hoc and cherry-picked and found via Google. Like they weren't, what I needed was therapy.
Right.
And, fortunately, was able to pull myself out of that, largely just through good friends and community and my husband. But the point being, I empathize with irrationality and even immorality, because I think I made him feel like a patient, not a person in this process. But I think of that when I think of the Trump voter, and I think, how can we get through to someone who's like me, with an eye on a sulfate allergy that is just not the problem?
Yeah, well, we all naturally, when things are not going well in any kind of deep sense, want to find an explanation. Ideally, a human who's responsible for it, or a group of people who are responsible for it. We all do that. And Trump is very good at exploiting the tendency.
Yeah, so that's just to say that's how I sort of see this, one option for not saying, I'm not writing anyone off. It's just I can't speak directly to concerns that are spurious. I think this is a problem on the left, that really needs to be thought through, slowly, carefully, and critically, self-critically.
I agree. Well, thank you. Is there anything you want to advertise aside from your book, like a Twitter handle or any social media presence or anything else?
I'm back on Twitter, so people are welcome to follow me, and I'm writing a new book called Untitled.
Good.
That will be on entitlement, the spurious sense of entitlement and the lack thereof that some girls and women, among others, feel to what is morally our due. So, it'll be coming out with Crown in the US and Penguin in the UK hopefully in time for the 2020 election.
So it's a trade book, as they say in the business, not an academic publisher.
Yeah, I love OUP, and they've been extremely good to me. So it was a tough decision to make, but I think this, for now, it's the right next book for me. So I'm very excited to be starting work on Untitled.
Well, that's great. And what is your Twitter handle?
Kate _man. It used to be Down Girl, but I decided that was asking for it.
Asking for trouble. Kate _MANNE.
Yes, thanks so much.
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot, Kate.
Thanks, Bob. It was great talking to you.
Same here.